collection. It's books related to and about AIM. Sorry, we're live.
Right on.
Good morning, everybody. Hamatak Yapi. We are joined by Jared Ware from Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. Today, Millennials Are Killing the Red Nation podcast. So welcome to the show, Jay. I don't think we've ever had you on, so I think this is your first time.
It's great to be here, Nick. Thank you so much for inviting me. Just shout out, fan of all the work that you do here with the podcast, but also, publishing and then the work you do organizing with Red Nation. And it's just great to be here. We haven't had you on in a while too. It's been several years now. And so it's good for us to reconnect and to talk. It's a funny topic to come on and talk about together, but I was joking with some of my audience that this is probably the most likely I've been to be canceled is talking about settlers on the Red Nation podcast. Like, some group of people is really going to hate what I have to say today, I'm sure.
Yeah, this is a book. I was trying to think this morning when I got up I was trying to think about when I actually first encountered it. And I'm tracing it back to when I was in college. I was part of some anarchist groups. And there were pages of this. Somebody had like photocopied pages of this, and it was like in a typeset, it looked like it had been typed on a typewriter. And I accumulated kind of like the entire manuscript, and then eventually it was like put on a PDF. And I remember reading it, and like I didn't have the terminology of settler at that time. And when I was reading it, honestly, it didn't really stick out to me. Like it wasn't something that I was like, wow, this is a foundational text. I was just kind of like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. But like later on, I think it was when I got into graduate school, people were really bashing this book. And I remember there was some one of my friends, she was using it to teach at a political ed class. And I sat in on some of it, and it was I was like, what's wrong with it? Like I was confused about it. And she was with the AAPRP, All African Revolutionary, I always forget the acronym.
It's All African People's Revolutionary Party. Yeah.
Right. And they actually have some really good political ed, and we've had them on the show before. And I was actually shocked by just the response that people had to it. And honestly, like when I first encountered it, it was mostly white anarchists who were reading it. And the second time I encountered it, it was, Pan-Africanists who were reading it. And the reaction to it, the hostile reaction to it, was mostly from like white Marxists or self-identified Marxists and communists. And I didn't really revisit it that much. Honestly, if you go through the history of the Red Nation podcast, probably every month or every week we get a request of, what are your thoughts on Jay Sakai's Settlers? And it's not like I was like avoiding this conversation. It's just that I felt like it was in some ways overrated, but also like an overhated text. And so I thank you for, speaking on behalf of your people to defend settlers. but yeah, you're gonna get canceled for this. But yeah, that was kind of my initial sort of interaction with this. And actually, I got the kind of the new version from PM Press and Kursplebedeb.
Yep.
Kursplebedeb. I can't say it.
Kursplebedeb. Yep.
Kurspled. I'm not gonna say it. So anyway, I think PM Press is an anarchist press. They used to be folks from AK Press. We've published one of the books on your shelf back there with PM Press. Good press, I think. This is a really nice book. It's a better format than the original one that I had. I think it was just like an 8.5 by 11. It was kind of a weird, like a strange format. It was more of like a zine. But I feel like this text, not to kind of like talk about aesthetics, but I feel like this text is a lot more approachable. I actually didn't read this version. I've had it for like probably 5 years now. I don't know. And I haven't actually picked it up and opened it because I just read the photocopied version that I used to have. I don't know where it's at. maybe I picked up like skimmed some chapters in this, but I really like this because not for aesthetic reasons, but it actually it can sit on your bookshelf, and it looks like a real text of theory, or a theory text that you can like teach in a classroom and stuff like that. And I kind of have I think at the time period when it was written, I think it was 1983 when it was published. It was kind of it was an underground text, like the zine culture. And I think that made sense because I have encountered a lot in my research, like these underground newspapers, and they're kind of cool, like aesthetically, it's just kind of like it's guerrilla, and because people didn't have access to printers and to mimeograph machines. So they were really like typesetting everything and, doing all this formatting by themselves. And so it kind of has that rough quality to it. And nowadays, people just have like blogs, or it's so easy to publish something. You can even like publish this like print on demand on Amazon,
Right.
And I think there are some publishers that do that. I think Peaceland and Breads or Iskra Books does that. I think they do like print on demand, and those are actually really nice. They're really nice books. I have a I think it's the second volume of the Stalin. Now that's going to get me canceled. Second volume of the Stalin collected works on my shelf. It's a really nice book. But anyways, to go back to this, I think it just makes it more accessible. But what's also wild is that it's a 400-page tome. This new edition includes an interview with Jay Sakai. So this is the text that I read, just so folks know. I don't think it's changed much from the original, but yeah, I just wanted to kind of add that in here to like kind of give folks a perspective of where I'm coming from and what I read.
Yeah, I read that version as well, and it's not different as far as I can tell from the prior version. Like I was going back and forth because the prior version is usually most of the PDFs you find online are of the older version. There are a couple of additional materials in that latest version, and I think the shift in typeset and all of that was intentional, because like J. Mufawad Paul has, he's a Maoist and also a
We're really getting canceled
professor
today.
yeah, that's fine. But he's somebody who has often pushed back against like some of the very critical reviews of this book. And one of the things that he says, which I think is true, is that one of the reasons that it wasn't picked up more in the academy were the reasons you pointed out, that it was like initially it was actually published by a group called Morningstar Press, which primarily published like materials that were being written by prisoners within the New African People's Organization, New African Prisoners Organization, NAPO. And, they were fairly prominent organizing in the Midwest inside in places like Indiana and Illinois and so on. And this book was really, I think, initially published, as I understand it, along with other books that Sakai was a part of. Primarily, it was bound so that they could send it in. Like that was kind of the purpose. And so that kind of anarchist milieu,
so they could send it into prisons, right?
Yeah. So that kind of anarchist milieu, Maoist milieu, like a lot of it has to do with this connections between sort of national liberation movements, political prisoners from the 60s and 70s, and who was doing that work. Like anarchists historically have done a lot of political prisoner solidarity, sometimes quite a bit more actually than Marxist-Leninist or Marxist organizations have. And so that's some of also, I think, kind of an interesting story around it is that, the reasons why it looked the way it did, it circulated in the circles that it did and so on. And I think we'll talk more probably about why maybe some of its orientation is something that anarchists might kind of overlap or align with anarchistic politics in certain ways. But, I think it's also just important to understand that there were these practical connections between Sakai and, people like James Yaki Sales from the New African Prisoners Organization. David Gilbert is one of the early people to kind of be in dialogue with this book. And so, yeah, people coming out of kind of, and there's a trajectory, I'd say, also from the Black Liberation Army to New African politics that's also connected in with kind of Sakai's, you know, belief, I think, about revolutionary change and the type of work that he was engaged in, which he really sees as like supporting national liberation movements. And you get that it's definitely like, I would say, kind of an early Maoist text to the extent that we start to delineate a Maoist politics in the United States and a Maoist politics that's kind of post Mao, if that makes sense, right? So there's the beginning of the elaboration of what people would now refer to as Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, where
Mhm.
you see even things like Shining Path in Peru and so on as like an articulation of a new way to do kind of armed struggle that's informed by the politics of Mao, so, and Maoism, the Chinese Revolution.
Yeah, that's really fascinating because, yeah, if anyone has ever sent, books to incarcerated comrades, it's like it's like a whole thing. Like I think now you can, some places only accept like from what they call like legitimate distributors like Amazon. So that's really fascinating. I didn't know about that history of the formatting. That's really cool. I mean, like as a nerd, like as somebody who like thinks about like why things are published the way they are, and aesthetically, yeah, it is dismissed because of those reasons. And also, you said this term "New African," and maybe you can kind of talk about what that means, but also talk about the language that he uses in this text, because I think it might help folk, because people are like, there's kind of these memes online, like on ML kind of meme channels. I'm not on them, but I've seen them, where they kind of make fun of the spelling of like America as like AMERIKA or KKKA. But maybe you can kind of talk about those aesthetics and why those word choices are important for this particular text.
Yeah, some of that I'll have to try to remember, but a book that talks about it behind me is Free the Land by Edward
Hmm.
Onissi. And it's a good book on kind of, we did a podcast episode on it years ago, but it's a good book about kind of the history of the New African movement. And there is a thing about C's and replacing them with K's, which part of it has to do with, I think that there was, I don't want to misspeak about that, but definitely the three Ks, right? We all understand is sort of like the white supremacist understanding of America, but they also choose to spell Africa with a K, and that's for, I think, more historical, cultural kind of reasons. But the importance of like their politics. So, the Republic of New Africa, I think, is 67 or 68 that they meet in Detroit, write a kind of Declaration of Independence, begin to write what would be the kind of foundations of their political thought. And the idea was essentially, um, I can't remember, it was more than 5 states initially, but it's basically the Black Belt, right? So it's kind of if you took the Black Belt thesis from the CPUSA, which said, like, in the South, in areas where Black people represent an overwhelming kind of majority of the population, that land should be ceded to them, right, for their own nation, basically, right? And so New African political thought kind of starts there, and there's a lot of different trajectories in it, right? So there are people who are more just kind of typical Black revolutionary nationalists. There's cultural nationalist kind of elements in it as well, but there's also communist elements within it. And so James Jacques Sales, who wrote a really good book, it's it's actually my favorite book on Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, which is called Meditations on Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. It's also published by Chris Blevadeb. But he espoused something that he would call like New African communist political thought, basically. And so trying to then kind of thread through the self-determination of Black people in the United States. New African as a term, also, an argument would be that basically Black people in this nation are African first, right? But they also constitute a new nation in a certain way, right? That they're not, because of the realities of the slave trade and slavery, like it's difficult to navigate back to like, okay, what part of Africa are we from? What is our historical lineage to this group of people or that group of people? And so they've been sort of created through that process as a distinct nation in a certain way, right? And so that's part of the thinking around it. And, there's also a material argument connected to the land of just saying, that they built up through their labor a lot of obviously this country, but also specifically the South, right? And so beyond that being a place where they represent a large percentage of the population, it also is a space where they've done, they have a connection to the land due to the labor that they, were forced to do on the land for a long time. And so that's a little bit of that, kind of movement trajectory. And it was one of the, kind of follows from Malcolm X, they take a lot from Malcolm X in terms of his thought, but obviously it really kicks off. Actually, his widow, Betty Shabazz, was, I believe, one of the early, she signed the Declaration of Independence for New Africa and was like part of the kind of group of people that were elaborating this thought, so yeah.
That's really interesting. And I think it's very clear in this book, I think even from the beginning, he's talking about, these, the African nation as a colonized, like an internal colony, basically. And this is something, we had Jared Ball on the show and he talked a lot about this. But what I think is fascinating about this is that he's talking about like settler colonialism. I don't think he actually uses the word settler colonialism. He's more interested in the class of people called settlers. But nonetheless, I think one of the elements of it that I found striking, and somebody who's coming from the academy, we're taught settler colonial theory coming out of the likes of Patrick Wolf. And if you want to hear kind of our critiques of that, go back to the Jared Ball podcast. But I'll say this, that Patrick Wolf was an anti-communist in many ways. He was an anti-Marxist. He didn't believe so much in national liberation, and he took a very kind of post-structuralist, postmodernist approach to creating this idea of settler colonialism. And what's fascinating is that like this would be the book, you think that he might cite in terms of understanding why that sort of class collaboration happens in settler colonies. But I think he was also kind of narrowing his definition in a way that didn't allow not only for the study or the analysis of settler colonies within like Africa, but also the idea of revolutionary subjects beyond the so-called native, right? And I think that's what Jay Sakai is arguing here, more so than kind of even looking at indigenous people, which we'll get into that later. I have some thoughts on that and in his analysis. But basically, his idea of a revolutionary subject within the colony that is the United States is sort of this Black nation or this new African nation. And that's very clear throughout. And it gains consciousness at certain moments, particularly, I think, the high point of which is the counter-revolution of 1776, or the so-called Revolutionary War, and looking at like the ways that African folks in North America specifically didn't ally with the settler class, or when they did, they had different sort of aspirations for what for the reasons why they were fighting. But we can get into that, and I guess the next question that you and I can maybe discuss is like, why all the hype around this book? And I'll just say, like, first off, the hype around this book is mostly due to I think an unserious online culture that really kind of blows things, like creates controversy. I have conversations with a lot of folks on the ground, and even my own students, about what's the difference between an intellectual and an actual, or an actual intellectual and an influencer, right? And I think it's hard to tell sometimes, especially when we're so online, that typically we don't watch movies, we just read reviews about them. We don't read books, we just read reviews about them. We're always ceding intellectual authority to somebody else. And I always encourage people, even if you don't agree with the book, you should just read it, man. I read so much bourgeois capitalist like press. It doesn't mean that I'm like agreeing with it, but I want to get the facts straight. I want to know how they're thinking, why they're thinking the way that they are. And honestly, the only places that I've ever seen this book honestly like studied in a real thorough, sincere way has been in study groups, like in-person study groups. And people, as much as like Marx wrote for the proletariat, right, or Mao Zedong wrote for the peasantry, he's writing, for Lenin was writing for revolutionaries in his own party, right? Jay Sakai is writing for people. He's not writing for an academic audience. He's very clear about, as you said earlier, he's writing for those on the inside, right, of America's kind of penal colony, or those who are in the sort of subterranean realm of the underground, the revolutionary underground. And that's what kind of, I think, is compelling. It doesn't make it less theoretically rigorous, but I think it makes it open for kind of like these ridiculous attacks and kind of, I think, unfair characterizations of it without really getting into the sort of, for lack of a better term, meat and potatoes of what he's actually talking about. Because we're all entitled, to our own opinions, but we're not entitled to our own facts, right? And I think the facts that he puts forward, I sound like a dad when I say that, but the facts that he puts forward, many of them are indisputable. There's some parts, we'll get into it, like minor critiques here and there about how he's interpreting events and historical sort of processes. But I think by and large, it's I don't think he's like lying. He's not cherry picking, pieces of history. It's like the long trajectory. And I think there needs to be, I think what the reaction to it is, I think people who, many of them are, I think some of them are sincere critiques, which, I'll give them that, and I'll grant them that, and I'll read them. But what's strange is that he's talking about how the reaction to anti-colonial resistance in a lot of ways often lends itself to self-victimization on the part of the settler. And so some of these people, on the left, or whatever you want to call them, revolutionaries or activists, who are reading this are also like self-victimizing in a weird way, without really maybe like considering the critiques that he's offering. So in some ways, it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy, in that like he's like saying, stop self-victimizing, and then they're like, oh, your theoretical interventions or processes are like hurting my feelings, or not making me feel like I belong to this movement. But that's not really what he's saying. And I think he's very generous in some points, of saying like there are like revolutionary white people, there can be like revolutionary settlers, so to speak. But he's more interested in looking at like, why is it that we've never had a revolutionary like communist or revolutionary party in the United States? I mean, the book Prisoners of the American Dream, which is right behind you, kind of opens with that context, right? And Mike Davis does a different sort of analysis and understanding it, but he's kind of doing the same thing. He's just arriving at sort of different conclusions, right? And so I think, the hype around this book has kind of mythologized it in really unproductive and unhelpful ways, which I think, it turns people off to actually engaging and reading it. But when I was reading it, I was like, there are like academics today who are now taking up some of these arguments and like refashioning as if they've discovered something new. And it's like, this has actually been argued within activists, circles, or within these circles for decades. It's like when somebody, a white Australian man, like discovers settler colonial theory, it's like everyone is just like, oh wow, this is amazing. And it's like, but there's a long genealogy here that has actually, I think, way more capacious in its understanding, not only of what settler colonialism is, but how it is an appendage of imperialism, right? And typically within activist circles, there's this kind of tendency to focus on the domestic realm of the United States at the expense of the rest of the world. And he's very clear. We can get into his definitions of labor aristocracy, but I think that's really at the heart of the hype, whether it's mostly, I would say, controversy and dismissal of this text, that I just want to kind of like, sort of clear the air about, because a lot of this is just what I was trying to read some criticisms online, and I was just like, you didn't read this book. Like you didn't read this book at all.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, what I'll say is like, so one of the things that he said about the book was that he began to write it in the mid 1970s. And he was just kind of questioning, like he says I was working in like an auto parts plant or whatever. He's a labor, he's working in labor. He also, I don't know if he was ever in Sojourner Truth organization, but he's cited in that book as providing a bunch of the materials to the author to write that book. And they're an interesting organization in this period, also in Chicago, that like tried white people work in a bunch of different capacities, like, had an analysis of white privilege, do we organize workers, all these kind of questions, right? And Sakai basically, I think, is just deeply frustrated at this point of like, why can't we get real anti-colonial solidarity from white workers? Like, why is it not happen? Why can't we even get it on the shop floor? Like, to some extent, like, why can't we unite and fight in the way that we're told that is just kind of a typical, like, kind of communists, labor politics, right? Of, hey, we should all come together on this factory floor, and we'll gain consciousness together, and be able to battle and fight the system. And so there's that frustration, and he claims that he wanted to go back and find the origins of it,
Hmm.
and he thought that maybe it was in the 1930s, and that he just kept going back, and he said, it was like I was treading water. I could never find the ground of this, and realized that, as he said, it took me all the way back to Plymouth Rock, basically. And I think that one of the things he says in relation to this is that the other kind of reason that he wrote the book was kind of a response to ethnic studies. That as there were all of these national liberation movements and struggles going on, in the US, also internationally, you mentioned, Black liberation. He also obviously talks in this about liberating Aztlan, which is like the kind of Chicano, movement, Southwest liberation. And then, he's Japanese American. He talks about his own experience in internment camps during World War II. And so he has this image, or this understanding of oppressed nations kind of fighting, and that was also the order of the day in the 60s and the 70s. Like the communistic politics were happening within a context of national liberation struggles. But what he said about the ethnic studies kind of thing is, he said, as these upsurges were happening, we were always encouraged to study ourselves, right? We're encouraged to study the history of Black people, encouraged to study the history of indigenous people or Asian people in America, and so on. He said the problem was that, like, we needed to study our oppressors. Like, if we wanted to, he said, most of the issues we were running into in these movements were not with each other, they were with white folks, and so I think that's something where, when white people encounter this book, um, it's not something that they're used to, is having, they might be used to critiques of white privilege written in a kind of academic language, or, showing a history of how, like, the Irish became white, and these kind of a process through which European, immigrants become kind of absorbed into whiteness and so on. But this is as you said, I mean, this is a historical materialist argument, and people could debate aspects of it. That's totally fine. But, he's saying, look, there are material material reasons why settlers came. There are
Mhm.
material benefits that they got through settler colonialism. And as the sort of settler expansion across the United States concludes, then imperialism picks up and offers, more kind of benefits to the labor aristocracy, which I know that we'll get into. Um, and so he kind of, you know, there's a way in which he looks at white people as kind of always constituting a sort of strata that is where a majority of them are really not workers, and those that are don't develop proletarian consciousness. So they don't
Mm,
develop a consciousness that says we are a part of a working class that is international, transnational, and we're connected to other members of our class that, don't look like us, come from different nations, and so on. And we should all fight alongside them, or also fight for their liberation, right? They tend to sell people of color out or participate in outright reactionary politics, whether that's the Klan or settler militias and all these other things, right? And I think maybe the most difficult part of the book is, we'll get to this, I'm sure, later, but the transition from that period of like where it's clear kind of settler colonialism, settler
right.
expansion to imperialism, and then, how and to a point where there is a large, really industrial working class of European people, right? And how he kind of deals with that. Um, but nonetheless, I think the controversy or the hype often comes from people who maybe read the first chapter or two and decide, like, I really don't like this book and I don't like where it's going because it's making me feel very uncomfortable.
I feel
I think it is.
attacked.
Yeah, I feel attacked. Um, and there are places both towards as the moves through the book, but also in other interviews he's done, where he is quite explicit. Like, look, I don't think that white people can't be revolutionary, like on an individual basis, or even that it's not possible for a working class or proletarian consciousness to emerge from groups of white people or a class of white people. It just hasn't happened, right? And so that, especially that latter point, that the kind of class consciousness proletarian development thing. And so he's like, I want to look through all the examples of history of trying to do that and where they have fallen short, or what are some of the issues that prevented that from really becoming truly revolutionary in its character. And I think on my opinion, is it does a pretty good job of that. Like, people can debate certain aspects of it, and having revolution within the heart of empire is certainly a very difficult thing to do. So, maybe I'd give a little bit more. I look to a lot of those movements for inspiration in different ways, is what I would say, probably. And so maybe that's one of the things people don't like about it, is that it has a critical lens kind of throughout, especially towards, predominantly white socialist, communist, anarchist politics. Um, so that's, I think, something that, you know, for instance, one thing we could say is like it's a scathing critique of the CPUSA, which,
Mhm.
people might, if you are in CPUSA or an organization that has, come out of that history that looks to the CPUSA as like, this is our revolutionary inspiration. He is really unsparing in his criticisms of the CPUSA in this book. And that's one reason, as well as him, like, he goes at a lot of prominent left-wing, communist scholars, whether it's Herbert Aptheker or, like Howard Zinn, who's not a communist, but a left-wing scholar for sure, and others. And yeah, I think there's some great work there, though, in terms of the criticisms that he brings to bear on a lot of that work.
We kind of skipped. This is my fault as host, but we skipped the question before that, and maybe this will actually let's go back to this question, then we can go back into the context of the book. But who is Jay Sakai? I think if you just Google Jay Sakai on the internet, you're only going to find images of the cover of this book. He's kind of a mysterious figure. There's people in the chat saying like he's still alive. And it's like, yeah, I think he still is. I don't know. Somebody said he recently did an interview at KPFA. I haven't heard that one, but maybe you can talk a little bit about what is known. I mean, most of, I guess, what is known about him is through the interviews that he has given, the public interviews that he has given, and provided some sort of biographical details. I really don't know much about him. I didn't do that kind of work to look and see who this individual was.
Yeah, so he is still alive. His book, The Shape of Things to Come, I think came out like last year or so. He still does work predominantly with Kurs Plebedeb in terms of the publishing. It's funny, some people refer to him as a member of the organization of Kurs Plebedeb, but Kurs Plebedeb is literally just a book publisher. And so he's not, a part of any kind of organization with them, but he is, one of their kind of, he's an author. So one of the things I should say is just list some of the books that he's been a part of, because this is also a Maoist thing, but a lot of the work is under pseudonyms, right? And so J. Sakai itself, I believe, is a pseudonym. That's my understanding. He is Japanese American, as I mentioned, lives in the Midwest, or at least did during all the period we're talking about. I don't know where he lives today. He is a little bit of a mysterious figure, but I do know people who have met him, who have been to his house, like this book I mentioned earlier about Sojourner Truth Organization. The author, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but Michael Staudenmeyer, like he talks in the acknowledgments about, going to Sakai's house, getting a bunch of the materials and thanking him for helping him to sort of write the book. And so I also know Dan Berger is somebody, he actually, in the Critical Ethnic Studies Reader, he does a piece which is actually kind of, it's a critical lens on ethnic studies, but it's basically saying people should read Settlers. They should read also the book Night Vision. Sakai is a part of what's called Red Rover, so there's another pseudonym. It's used in Night Vision. So Night Vision is like this really kind of anti-colonial feminist oriented text, but it's also a text that elaborates something he does in this book as well, which is he talks a lot about neo-colonialism and counterinsurgency strategies as well. And that book is written in 93. So it's interesting because, or it's published in 93. So it has a little bit of a 90s lens, whereas this one is written in 83. And it's really looking back at really the history from, like, I guess kind of Jamestown era, like 1700s up through, 1960. About, he doesn't really get into the New Left era that much
Right.
in this book. He does a couple things, but not much. And then another book, False Nationalism, False Internationalism, which has, it's like E. Tani and Kai Sarah, I think, are the names of the authors that are attributed to. But he's also, along with Butch Lee, who's the lead author of Night Vision, a part of the collective. So participated in a series of like collective projects too. And false internationalism, sorry, is it's a challenging book, but it's like very critical lens also on a lot of the kind of anti-colonial or anti-imperialist politics from the 60s and 70s and into the early 80s. Including like a criticism of Brinks, right, which is like, how one of the ways in which a bunch of the political prisoners like David Gilbert, as well as Sekou Odinga, Kwesi Balagoon, that, they end up being incarcerated after this. And so he's done a lot of work, and I think the thing I appreciate about him too is like that he's also he's a very critical thinker, and he's critical of like movements he's been a part of. He thinks critically about organizations. He'll criticize anarchists in one thing, and then he'll criticize Maoists or criticize Marxist Leninists. I remember one thing reading about him talking, I think this is in Shape of Things to Come, where he's like, look, nobody has figured this out. Like, it's difficult, so he's actually quite generous, I think, in a lot of his other writings, in ways maybe people don't feel about Settlers as a text. But I think there are, as you said, kind of generous moments within it. And so, not a lot else is kind of known about him beyond his publishing. I'm sure there are people within his life who know more about him. This is often something that's kind of used by people to say, oh, he's a Fed, or, this kind of thing. I think it has more to do with that kind of Maoist, sensibility of like, we're not going to put ourselves out there to be sort of targeted. And it's more about the ideas that we're going to put forward. And we're not really looking to be kind of, public intellectual celebrity kind of things. But it also, I think, in some ways creates a kind of mysterious thing and mystique for some people too. So that's there. But I'm trying to think if there's anything else I could say about him. You know, Other than, I think, he cites, the KPFA interview was referenced. So that was actually in 2003, but I definitely recommend people listen to it because you hear his voice, you hear him talking about his own history a little bit. He talks a lot about the Chicano liberation movement in that particular interview, because the person who's interviewing him is just interested in those politics. And he also talks a lot about like why he wrote Settlers and what he was looking to do with it and the intervention he was trying to make and some of the things that it is and isn't. But yeah, so that's a little bit.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's I honestly, like, I think it was like your references to Jay Sakai in an interview you did with Ori Burton on I don't remember what it was about something about counterinsurgency.
Yeah, Frank Kitson's Low Intensity Operations, which is a
Right.
book like Sakai had read, and then he critiques it, but also talks about it to other folks sometimes.
Yeah, and it just kind of like brought me back, and I started reading that, and I was like, oh wow, like, the interview from The Shape of Things to Come, and I was like, wow, this is actually, I think he has some really important, things to say in this interview, and like, so that's what the kind of inspiration for this particular interview came from. So appreciate it.
Just quickly on that point, like, yeah, I think his interviews are really good. Like, I think that, there's a problem often I find within organizations in the United States that there's not a lot of self-criticism that gets published or shared
Mhm.
where people can kind of see, and there are reasons for that. Like, organizations are not necessarily trying to like write their own demise or participate in efforts. They're often under attack in different ways already, and they don't want to kind of self-contribute to those things. And I think that's part of why. And organizations do self-critique internally and so on. But the thing I appreciate about Sakai is that he'll be really generous, but also kind of unsparing. And so he has a way of sort of like, obviously I believe that he's somebody who deeply wants to see revolution on Turtle Island, right? But at the same time, like, he recognizes that we're not in a good place on the left and is open about talking about different reasons that he thinks as to why. Now, sometimes I agree with things he has to say, and sometimes I don't think he's right. But like, I just appreciate that kind of critical lens. And that's one of the things I like about Chris Blebedeb as a publisher overall, is that they publish a lot of stuff that's actually from people who have been in movements, like whether communist or anarchist, that is also like self-critical and reflective. And I think that's the way I would describe kind of, what Sakai does. Now, if people aren't Maoists, they're going to disagree with certain ways that you know, he levies some of these critiques in ways that some of his abstractions, I guess you could say, or his ways of looking at revolutionary change. But I think there's a lot of valuable content, whether you agree with that or not.
Yeah, I agree, and I think let's just maybe start this kind of summary of the chapters or the sections of the book, in like the way that you just start, like the way that you kind of split it up between, like, it's a periodization thing. I don't know. I have some critiques of, just because he's probably reading a body of literature that does this, and so he's just like, kind of repeating this, but there's not a clear connection between like pre 1890 and post 1890. And the point, kind of the turning point or the linchpin on that is, the massacre at Wounded Knee, the end of sort of the frontier, the end of the frontier myth, or the end of, like, the myth of the end of the frontier, I should say that. where you have people like Frederick Jackson Turner kind of lamenting the end of the frontier and how the idea of the frontier was the driving force of history. And so maybe we can talk about that kind of pre-1890 piece, because I think there's those two kind of fields of thought, like, you know, the origins of the United States as an empire and sort of the industrial sort of proletariat and the labor kind of history, are not talked about together. They're often kind of like separated. I think he kind of repeats a little bit of that, and it's not the easiest. I think it gets a little bit messy, and I think a little bit reductive in some points, but I think nonetheless he does a good job. But the sort of foundations of the United States are very much in line with what people like Gerald Horne have written about extensively. I mean, Gerald Horne has like so many books. You know, the kind of the settler colonial trilogy of, there's like the dawning of the apocalypse of settler colonialism, and then there's the counter revolution of 1776. And I actually think they were written in reverse order. I think it was 1776, the dawning of the apocalypse, or the apocalypse of settler colonialism, and then the dawning of the apocalypse of settler colonialism. But he pretty much argues similar things that J. Sakai is doing in here. And you mentioned earlier that the kind of settlers that came over, the initial sort of, I would say, Anglo settlers, he doesn't really go into kind of Spanish colonialism, but he's looking more at like kind of like Anglo settlers who had, you know, the pilgrim mythology. You know, they'd gone to Denmark, I think, or I can't remember where, and then they came to what became, you know, the United States or the New World. But they were not laborers, you know, they were kind of like petty bourgeois folks, people who were like the merchant class. They didn't really bring a lot of women with them. They didn't bring their families. This was like a commercial enterprise about land. And so he's kind of really beginning, taking apart the sort of pilgrim mythology. I think the more salient point in this is how he kind of deconstructs Bacon's rebellion. Because that kind of gets held up as like, look, you know, this is this kind of early articulation of Black-white solidarity. And there's been, this is like actually like a kind of a controversy recently in the academy, and there was like several articles that were published about it, specifically kind of like trying to parse out what is settler colonialism. And if, like, some people argue, you know, settler colonialism, the organizing principle of settler colonialism is the elimination of the native. So that's where you can get sort of this collaboration of, you know, enslaved African people or imported African people who are collaborating with settlers to eliminate native people to take land, right? And I actually think that's reductive, and he does a really good job of actually saying that, well, this whole thing was just kind of a creation about the terms of warfare, exterminationist warfare against native people. That's really what was being debated here. You can read the book to kind of get into the nuances of that, but I think he does a good job. And what's fascinating is, like, this is kind of like a historical debate that's still ongoing, because it's still held up by a lot of these academic Marxist historians as proof of, you know, early white and Black solidarity, and try to build something. But it wasn't so sort of like neatly cut that way. And I think maybe like you can kind of go through how he understands class formation in this early period, because it's not like, I think people might look back and just say, hey, these were just like, you know, people, they didn't bring anything with them. They're, you know, striking it out on their own. Being a settler was hard. Like that's often the kind of terminology that's used. Like, it's difficult, you know, like carving civilization out of the wilderness. But he really kind of debunks a lot of that to say that this was not, a lot of these people didn't have, you know, calluses on their hands, so to speak. They weren't from the laboring classes. And that kind of, in some instances, he doesn't get into it, but in some instances, like, the history is that kind of led to the failure of certain colonies, is because they couldn't work. Like, they didn't have anybody. If they couldn't enslave people to do that work for them, or if they couldn't steal you know, the resources from people, they would actually resort to cannibalism oftentimes, because they were just so inept in terms of producing and being self-sufficient. But he kind of locates the origin story of class, right, of a class system in this early period, and I think it's worth, if you want to like maybe take a stab at like how he understands that.
Sure, yeah, I'll take a stab. I mean, I definitely encourage people to read this. It's kind of, first chapter I think is really where he goes into this, but um the argument is a lot of what you laid out, right? Which is that settlers came here. I mean, there was obviously not a lot of land in Europe for people to, land was owned by, feudal lords and, bourgeoisie and so on in Europe, right? And so for really kind of like, as he lays it out, sort of middle class people within Europe, that there wasn't really any kind of mobility for them and or a way for them to get to land, right? And so this offered an incentive, right? And this was financed and everything, but to come here and they could get land, right? And so what he lays out, right, is that okay, there's some essential components of this to understand. One, that this involved genocide, right? That this involved going to war with indigenous people to secure this land, right? He does also talk about instances of indigenous slavery as well then as African slavery, as well as indentureship, right? And I think indentureship is one of the interesting areas in this text too, because he makes an argument there that's different than what you see a lot of kind of historians making around indentureship, which a lot of times they want to make an argument that white indentureship, was sort of like slavery, but for a shorter period of time. And so again, this was really hard, right? As you said, and we shouldn't think of indentured workers as settlers, right? They are people who come and they worked for settlers for a period of time and then got their freedom, right? Is sort of the way that story's told. Sakai looks at it differently, and he says basically, look, indenture was short period. One thing we have to remember is that life in the 1700s or 1600s was hard, like wherever you were. Like it's not an easy. We don't have today's like technology and conveniences and all of this, and um, so yeah, people had to do the labor, right? And that was mostly done by slaves, and that's the point that he makes. It's part of his whole argument is, especially early on, that Africans constituted the proletariat in the United States. And this is where his argument, I think, as you said, there are a lot of similarities between his arguments and Gerald Horne's. It's also interesting because they're two people that are very much despised by kind of a same tendency of communists. Um, but he's saying, look, that they were indentured for a period of time. It might have been rough for 4 years, but at the end of that, they got land and they themselves became settlers, right? And so again, he one of the things he says, and I think this is one of the things that people don't like, is that he says parasitism is the
Mm-hmm.
principal characteristic of Euro-American society. This is why they don't develop proletarian consciousness or solidarity with oppressed nations, right? And so this idea is that settlers constituted a parasitic strata. Like they were not self-sufficient. They were not able, the mythology of the settler living on the single family farm where the children are doing some work, the dad, the father's doing some work, the woman's doing the housework, right? That this idea, which also forms the kind of foundation of a sort of nuclear family mythology in the United States, that this is a myth, that even smaller scale settlers, they might only have one slave or two slaves, but it still was a predominantly slave owning kind of structure. And he goes through this with data, like he represents the arguments even in different areas like New England, where people might say, oh well, there wasn't as much slavery there or whatever. um and I think that in general, what he says about the parasitism issue is important, which is that white people in the United States kind of develop a mythology or a characteristic where ultimately they don't want to work. Like, the goal is to have other people, to be able to pay people or not pay people to do other work for you, and to be able to have land, right? And so it is a kind of like bourgeois. He uses the term that the white working class has been like bourgeoisified, basically. That the idea,
Bourgeoisified.
yeah,
I was
however
trying to
you would
pronounce
say that.
it.
Yeah, yeah.
Bourgeoisification.
And so that there becomes, he's not arguing that they're all the bourgeoisie,
Yeah.
and he's not even necessarily arguing. He would say that there's a kind of petty bourgeois consciousness, but the argument is just that the goal is not necessarily to be a part of the laboring class and to be able to define the world alongside your fellow laborers. That the goal is actually to be above the laboring class and to have their work benefit you in different ways. And I think that this is one of the issues, is that it creates a kind of paradigm that really a lot of Marxists do not like, even though he does it in a kind of dialectical materialist way of laying it all out. um he's basically arguing that there is no white proletariat, like it didn't ever form. And this is obviously, we're talking about Bacon's Rebellion. You laid out that in that era, but he's just sort of saying this is like an early mythology and national consciousness kind of issue around white people, that they have this image of the kind of self-managed farm, and but that reality is that this is based off of their own involvement in forms of labor exploitation and theft of land, basically. And so that's as best I could kind of summarize it.
Yeah, it even like does a little bit of a genealogy, or maybe it was Lenin. I can't remember if he was citing Lenin or not, but he does like a genealogy of the term proletariat. And it goes back
Yeah.
to Rome, which was a slave society. And uh the proletariat were those who were basically just, their job was to produce the soldiers that fought in the Roman Empire. And they were like they weren't really workers either, because they had enslaved people to do all the laboring. So it's like, he's like, this isn't like unique to history. There are societies that provided, or that sort of created a group of laborers that were constantly exploited, whether it was through enslavement or through low wage, or whatever it was, the extraction process. And I thought it was fascinating, because he's like, we shouldn't valorize or romanticize the idea of a proletariat on one hand, because it doesn't necessarily mean that it's like the revolutionary class in the context of struggle. And he, look at revolutionary Russia. He was, Lenin knew that it didn't matter if they just organized the proletariat. They would never win a revolution, because, the vast majority of people lived out on the land. They weren't proletarianized in the same way. They weren't working in factories. They were peasants, right? They were people who a lot of Marxists had seen as backwards. And I think to kind of build on the point that he's making here, he's like saying, like, we sort of valorize a class of laborers in what became the United States, without really understanding like who was actually doing the work and who was actually moving history. It wasn't necessarily white settlers. It was the pushback against those white settlers through slave rebellions, through indigenous anti-colonial resistance, like that kind of dialectic of resistance. Like, it was foundational to the founding of the United States. And if you just valorize labor, like as he's making this point very clear, this was not a laboring class in the way that others were. And what's also fascinating about this is, like, he talks about he's like one of the few scholars, I call him a scholar. He's one of the few sort of thinkers and scholars that really looks at indigenous slavery and its importance to the founding of the United States. There was this other book that just came out recently, won a bunch of awards. It's called The Other Slavery. And it's like it's recent, but this is like, well, this is well known, and that often gets sort of disappeared into sort of the kind of the realms of history in terms of how we understand not just indigenous dispossession, but also indigenous exploitation. I think that's important to kind of point out. And I appreciated his kind of, if you want to call it an intervention or inclusion of that into this. And then, we can maybe jump into like what leads up to this kind of this transition, what he calls a transition to sort of, or what you had called the transition to imperialism. I would argue that it was imperialist all along because it was expansionist and annexing territory. I think if folks want to read a book on this, Manu Karuka's book called Empire's Tracks, is a very good sort of theorization of settler colonialism as an imperialist project. He looks at trains, but don't let that like discourage you. It's not about choo-choo trains. It's actually about following the transcontinental railway, because he looks at like Lenin. If you read Lenin's theory or book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, he's looking at the expansion of railroads in colonial Africa, right? And what if we applied that same sort of methodology to the way of westward expansion in what became the United States or North America? Why is one called imperialism and the other is not, right? So that'd be my only sort of argument. And I think that actually, this is probably because there wasn't much literature written on it at the time, but it might help boost the kind of the interventions that he's making in the sort of what he calls like, the age of imperialism, or, proper, right after the 1890 moment. But
Yeah.
I also think that
I would
I'll
agree
go
with that too, by the way, Nick. I would just say that, yeah, I mean, I think, and it had actually also, you know, I think a lot of people lump this book in with settler colonial studies in a certain way, but the people who are critical of it, that are also critical of some of the things that some of the interventions made within kind of an academic settler colonial studies. And I think, it's interesting to think about whether it would be more, if it would be thought about differently if it was a book about imperialism and the role that white people, the white proletariat, had played within imperialism across the continent and so on. But yeah, I mean, I agree with the point you're making about, settler colonialism and the expansion of it being an imperialist project.
Yeah, and I think the history of the United States is really told in the sort of core I mean, it is a metropole and colony in some ways, because you do have the industrial um Northeast, and then you have like what would be kind of like the feudal South, with the plantation aristocracy and everything. But it's like, it didn't, the house wasn't fully built when it traveled across the Atlantic Ocean, right? It was stolen. It was built from the minerals taken from, the land. The bones built the sort of architecture, it was the lumber that provided the skeleton of that house, like all those sorts of things. I'm using a lot of sort of metaphors here, but I think it's important to point that out. And also, Native people didn't just like kind of disappear into the myths of history. They were very foundational in the sense of like the United States built itself against indigenous nations, right? It built itself in it built its military capacity to defeat indigenous nations. It wasn't the only game in town. Not only European, empires, there was the British Empire, the French Empire, the Spanish Empire, all had footholds in North America. And as he points out in this, in this piece, like leading up to the revolution, the American Revolution, that a lot of Native people and a lot of enslaved African people or freed African people were like, no, like the European settler colonial project, or European or Euro-American colonists, and the nation and the state and the project that they want to build is actually detrimental to our aspirations and our goals and our existence and our livelihoods. So we have to resist this from the very beginning. There's, we can, I point this out every time, and I think people get like frustrated with it, but it's like, it's literally written in the Declaration of Independence. If you read the Declaration of Independence as a piece of literature, the final grievances, it's a kind of a crescendo sort of piece. The final grievances against the British Crown are the merciless Indian savages on the frontier, which is native people, and the domestic insurrections, which is slave revolts. Those are the two kind of final points that Thomas Jefferson puts in, the Declaration of Independence as a piece of literature. And it shows you that this is sort of setting the stage of not only the kind of republic that is the white republic that's being built, but also setting the stage of who the enemies of that white republic actually are. They're external, but then they, over time become the sort of internal enemies of that empire. And sorry to kind of elaborate on that, but I don't know if you wanted to add something.
No, I think that's great. Yeah, and I mean, I guess as we move to, like, before maybe we get to the sort of 1890 transition, one thing we should say is, like, he also deals with the era of Reconstruction, the Civil War. He does, as you said, deal with the Revolutionary War. So, like, it's one of those books where, honestly, it's funny. A lot of the things that I've heard it critiqued for, it's quite clear, like you said, that the people who critique it didn't read it, because it's like a lot of the things that he gets to in terms of some of these areas where, people I mean, like, even that settler period, I could see people critiquing it, and I had questions about it somewhat reading it, of like, well, how much does it make sense to talk about proletarian in the context of colonial United States, like, anyway, right? Like, this is not really, is this really, industrial capitalism at this period of time? Like, what are, he's like, there's a part where he's saying, like, look, people are artisans and craftsmen and this and that. And I'm like, well, that's kind of what there is in terms of
Yeah.
labor in that period of time, so
You
it's
didn't
not
have the
like a
modern
whole,
factory system.
yeah, it's not like a whole bunch of people are working in a factory in like 1680, like, that's just, but nonetheless, like, he deals with a lot of that as it goes on, right? So as real industry comes in, like, he always kind of revisits his arguments and um his conclusions, and kind of updates and tweaks them as it moves through history, which I think is a very kind of dialectical lens on it, to say, look, like, okay, like, these are the abstractions, or the way that I've analyzed this period, and then moving into this period, these are some of the ways that things shift and become complicated, but this is how those things play out historically. And so I just say that to say, there's a lot of good work there in terms of that whole period up until the kind of 1890s. But I do think there's kind of a shift in where the book goes once you get through that
Yeah.
phase of colonial expansion.
Yeah, and it's, this is like a synthetic, I think it's called a synthetic history. It's a long history. It's trying to synthesize all these sort of things. It's hard to do. I mean, it's most people, he did it in 400 pages, but this kind of early period is setting up, these ideas that he's going to elaborate more on. And maybe this is a good sort of segue into that part, which is like, there's a proletarian consciousness. Like, why hasn't a proletarian consciousness developed again within kind of settler society or white settlers? And then the second is the kind of development of a labor aristocracy. So maybe I'm gonna punt that one to you, to kind of maybe walk us through what he means by that proletarian consciousness, the failure of a proletarian consciousness on one hand, and then the development of a labor aristocracy. And one point I want to just make, sorry to ask those questions and then make this point, but read Du Bois' Black Reconstruction. He cites it, he pulls out some block quotes in the text, but it's actually just worth sitting down and reading that entire book, because it's the best explication of Reconstruction and its failure, and his kind of theory, the theory of a black proletariat, and, like, I guess a revolutionary moment where you liquidated an entire class of people, the plantation aristocracy. But put a pin in that, go read it yourselves. To you, the proletarian consciousness and the labor aristocracy.
Yeah, so the proletarian consciousness, I think, is a fairly, to me, it's a fairly easy point to kind of draw in terms of what he means by that. And he definitely draws this from the the Marxist canon, basically, Marx, Engels, Lenin, and so on. But it's basically that it's not enough. So like you can have workers, right? But what do those workers want? Is their consciousness that they want more wages and better benefits for themselves? Like everybody wants those things. And so that's kind of what some folks. J. Mufawad Paul has a good book on economism, actually, where he kind of talks about this a little bit. But um, it's like a trade union consciousness is what we might call it, right? Which means that you just wanting better conditions for yourself is not actually revolutionary, right? Like that's just basic self-interest. And basic self-interest dictates, if you're in industry, that you probably should band together with your fellow workers to collectively bargain those conditions. And so again, this is not a bad thing. Like he's not against this idea, and neither should we be, I don't think. But we also have to recognize that it is not revolutionary in itself. Like just wanting something better for yourself is, just kind of it's selfish, it's individual, and it's okay. Like it's better for the workers to have more than for the owners, the bourgeoisie, the capitalists to have more. So like we're always with that. We're always with laborers fighting for their wages and benefits and so on. But what is the transmission belt between that and revolution, right? And proletarian consciousness is moving beyond being a class in itself, right? A class that exists, right? That there are a bunch of workers, we all work, we're in this industry together, we have a shared kind of condition, and so we're a class on that basis. But proletarian is then like a class for itself, right? Which is like a class that advocates for the needs of its entire class. And, Marxists or communists, they want to look at this as, okay, workers are in a prime place. They can stop the means of production. They can halt work. They can withhold their labor, and they can demand more. They can kind of impose their will upon the capitalist system and hopefully ultimately overthrow it, and then kind of democratize, right, the benefit, create a new society essentially, where the workers would be in control of the means of production and could decide the way that their society should look. And Sakai is saying that white workers in particular, and by this, as you said, like he's looking predominantly at kind of Anglo-Saxon here, like, English settlers, and then their history and people may not know this, but they, it's important to say is like that idea of kind of a white Anglo-Saxon uh, settler identity, which then takes on a kind of nativist characteristic also at a certain point, that basically that you know I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought, but basically that
Like,
constituted kind of the ruling, the higher majority. When we think about white supremacy, those
right.
were the people at the top of it, right? And European immigrants that come in later, which is partly where we get to when we get to like the late 19th century and into the 20th century, that they come in actually as oppressed nations, is the way
Mhm.
Sakai looks at it as well. But they end up making bargains basically to be more like the white Anglo folks, right? And to have the kind of privileges that they have within the system. And so I guess that's one of the things to connect those points, is that looking to privilege yourself or your group of people within the system is also not a revolutionary consciousness. Like a revolutionary consciousness would say, no, like all of us as workers, or all the workers and oppressed people of this nation, need to kind of band together to create something new that serves all of us and meets our different needs, not just, hey, like I want my group to be second in the tier to the white
Right.
Anglo people, like maybe we can be right beneath that. And so the labor aristocracy point. I mean, I'll read a little bit because he cites Engels on this, and I think that it's good for people to see this because a lot of people see this as like a
What pages
deviation.
I can pull it up on. I just pulled up the PDF. So if you tell me the
Let me
page number,
see.
I can pull it up so folks can read along.
Yeah, so it's page. I don't know if we have the same version. It's 51 in the one that's like typeset.
Oh, how does it start? I can text
So
search it.
it starts with in 1858, Engels sarcastically.
Okay, yeah, I can pull it up here. Let me just switch over. Share my screen.
And there's actually probably a paragraph before that I want to read a little bit of too.
Sounds good. Let me just pull it up here. All right. Hit present. Share screen. All right. Let's see if folks can see this. This one?
All right, yeah. So I'll start with that. Yeah, the tossing of a few crumbs. So the tossing of a few crumbs to the British workers resulted in a growing ideological stagnation, conservatism, and national chauvinism. Engels was outraged and disgusted, particularly at the corrupt spectacle of the British workers. So important just to say, this is Engels talking about England and the English working class. Engels was outraged and disgusted, particularly at the corrupt spectacle of the British workers slavishly echoing their bourgeoisie as to their alleged right to exploit the colonial world. Quote, this is a quote from Engels. There is no workers' party here, and the workers gaily share the feast of England's monopoly of the world market and the colonies, end quote. Then he goes on to say, in 1858, Engels sarcastically described the tame British workers in the bluntest terms, quote, the English proletariat is actually becoming more and more bourgeois, so that this most bourgeois of all nations is apparently aiming ultimately at the possession of a bourgeois aristocracy and a bourgeois proletariat alongside the bourgeoisie. For a nation which exploits the whole world, this is to a certain extent justifiable. And then he goes on to talk about, Britain was the imperial Rome, the American empire of that day, a nation which feasted on the exploitation of colonies around the entire world. Engels, as a communist, didn't make lame excuses for the corrupt English workers, but exposed them. He held the English workers accountable to the world proletariat for their sorry political choices. So that I just think that kind of summarizes his position on what he would call the labor aristocracy, which some people say, well, look, Lenin defined it a little bit differently. Engels defined it a little bit differently. Sakai is doing something else. I think it's really important to say, like, he's really basing this analysis saying, look, Engels is saying this exact same thing about English workers who are not showing any solidarity to the oppressed nations that are being oppressed by British imperialism. And that's the same argument that Sakai is making around the sort of, white working class in the United States, is that they're, they're not really looking for something, they're not looking to be in solidarity with folks in other parts of the world or oppressed people within the United States, that they are, they lean into, as he says, an ideological stagnation, a conservatism, and a national chauvinism. So,
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. And it brings to mind, like, just for folks who are interested in reading more, the Domenico Lacerdo has a book called Western Marxism. There's also another book. I don't know if I have it here. It's about class formation. I can't remember what it's called. Something, I think it might just be called class formation. I could be wrong. I'll look and see, but it's published by Routledge. It's kind of hard to get. It's kind of expensive, but it's a good book because it says a lot of the things that he's saying here, but he's looking more at it like a European context, and like how Europe is also sort of there's like uneven development in Europe, and like how class formation. Like Marx looked, Marx and Engels looked at the British sort of proletariat for like practical reasons. Like, Engels's father was a factory owner, so like that was their kind of window into industrial capitalism. So that's what they were looking at. It wasn't because they were trying to valorize, the British proletariat as sort of like revolutionary in certain ways, but they were seeing, like in this sense, like the labor aristocracy that does sort of develop, or the bourgeoisification. I'm not really quite sure how Lenin theorizes it, but I do know that Lenin very much chastises his own comrades for forgetting about the colonies and the enslavement of the colonies that sort of benefit the industrial proletariat in ways. It's not to say like they're just living this like lavish lifestyle, but it is to say that not understanding, having an incorrect analysis of imperialism leads to sort of reactionary and chauvinistic tendencies. Case in point for Lenin was World War I, when you had social democratic and allegedly communist sort of movements allying with their nation, their country against others, and pushing, the great conflict of imperialist powers, and kind of forgotten in all this sort of history of World War I as a European civil war, is that much of that was fought in the colonies and fought by colonized people. To kind of get into to add a little bit of more texture to this, and to understand sort of the nuances and the complexities of this, like Native people were enlisting in to fight in World War I. Some of that you could argue was coerced. They weren't even citizens of the United States, but they were fighting just as Indian colonized subjects were fighting for the British Empire, and fighting and dying. And again, like if you look at the imperialist wars, it's often lamented about the loss of European lives and completely forgetting about the colonial context. And like Lenin was very specific about that. He's like, they die at, like they're sacrificing so much, and it's like it doesn't matter who the outcome of this war for those in the colonies, because imperialism will still be the order of the day, in parts of the world that are colonized. And I think this is very much akin, this quote that you read really speaks to like that kind of reality, the sort of the ordering of the world in an imperialist sort of context. But like obviously a war is a kind of very dramatic kind of a dramatic sort of event, but nonetheless the exploitation, things that Marxism is always talking about, the law of value, right? The value of something is often realized in the first world and through consumerism. And I'm not talking about consumerism of the 21st century. I'm talking about consumerism of the late 19th, early 20th century. That there was still the extractive sort of element of capitalism. It didn't, it's not a new phenomenon. It's something that was, that's kind of inbuilt to the very sort of foundation of capitalists, and what people called the world system, right? So yeah, I appreciate that piece, and it really kind of lends itself to the development of labor unions, industrial labor unions at this time. There's sort of a spectrum that he looks at. He looks at sort of the more radical left ones, like the Wobblies, and then he looks at the more conservative reactionary ones, which like the AFL-CIO. So we can get into that. I don't know if you have some thoughts on that. I kind of skipped over it a little bit because I think Mike Davis does a really good job at kind of going through that history. But if you want to maybe touch a little bit on some of the high points in that piece or in that section.
Yeah. So he does look at a lot. So I guess one thing I should say too is worth noting. He also looks at the early phases of the socialist and kind of communist movement in the United States in the middle of the 19th century. And people don't talk of, if people do talk about it, they tend to kind of valorize it or whatever, but it was a white nationalist movement essentially. Like people of color, black people, indigenous people, like they were not a part or included within the earliest socialists in the United States. And so it also wasn't a movement that was really attacked, and it wasn't also a movement that had a whole lot of energy. Um, but that that part, definitely, he does look at the IWW, he does look at the CIO, and I think he looks at the CIO even a little bit more than the AFL CIO, because the CIO was definitely, CPUSA is kind of heavily involved there. There is some integration within the CIO as opposed to um, the AFL. But and he has like some real, I think he sees inspiration in these movements, and he does see like some proletarian consciousness. He does see some anti-racism within them. He sees some kind of, like, a lot of times he doesn't talk so much about solidarity, but around kind of tactical and strategic unity, right? That people can come together from different nations and different perspectives, and they can organize together on a certain campaign or a certain strategy and so on. But in both cases, and I don't know to the extent to which I'm fully on board with his argument here, but what he looks like is that basically he sees the IWW as basically abandoning its role, especially in World War I, right? And they basically agree not to fight against the war effort. They agree not to oppose the war effort. And again, you spoke of Lenin. Like, this is a tendency that he critiqued across all of Europe, right? It's one he probably critiqued it across the United States as well. It's certainly a tendency that I disagree with, right? This idea that as laborers, like, we should continue doing our jobs if we work in industries that support the war. And so, you know, basically they didn't have a general strike, anti-war. And so he looks at this as an example of the IWW failing in its revolutionary responsibility. I think the more important point about it too is that they get crushed anyways after this, right? So they agree to load the docks, to load the war effort, to send the bombs and so on to Europe for World War I. And even despite that, they get a bunch of repression. A bunch of their leadership gets locked up. And basically this is a big, moment where the IWW kind of becomes less relevant. And I think the other point that he draws out there, if I remember correctly, is that this also coincides with a lot of workers choosing less revolutionary unions. And so there's that period of kind of revolutionary industrial unionism, anarcho-syndicalism with the IWW. And then after that, people shift to the right. And then there's the CPUSA period. He talks about that a lot. He looks at the history of the CIO. Again, like his actual chapters on this stuff, I feel like, are fairly nuanced. He's not antagonistic to the aims or the ways that people begin to come together and do a more revolutionary form of union organizing. But his basic argument is that they always end up kind of aligning with US imperialism when war efforts come about. And they often, you know, turn their back or, become kind of violently exclusionary or reactionary towards other oppressed groups, whether it's, he talks about, Chinese workers and the kind of anti-Chinese hysteria, the Chinese Exclusion Act, all of this. He talks about the ways that he gets into the New Deal and talks about all the ways that the New Deal, represented a kind of counterinsurgent thread, including a really interesting chapter where he talks about kind of how the New Deal also broke up a lot of African, or Black, but he uses the term African land ownership in the South. And so, yeah, there's a long history there of, just kind of looking at each of these moments of revolutionary potential within labor. And then I'd say the things that he typically comes away with is that the Europeanized or the European immigrants tend to side with empire and tend to side with, you know, trying to get closer up that ladder of sort of whiteness, which he recognizes as a hierarchy. Like he does see, you know, Polish or Irish immigrants as oppressed within the industrial system and so on. But rather than, you know, seeing themselves as having common cause with, you know, oppressed nations or Black people or Chinese workers or Japanese workers, he goes through the history of also Japanese internment and stuff like that during FDR. So it's a real strong critique also of that kind of New Deal era. And I think a lot of the things that are probably important about all of this is I would say it's kind of, the book is a counter history to kind of a dominant kind of CPUSA or progressive history of a lot of these struggles, which would seek to kind of valorize them a bit beyond what they actually deserve. And he's really like digging in all the places that he can criticize. And so I think probably the truth among some of that stuff is somewhere in between, where it's like he's really trying to pick apart as much as he can all the areas that he can critique, whereas there's, you know, another communist tendency that would say, hey, these are the actual movements we want to draw our inspiration from. And so we're trying to create an inspirational history around this stuff. And I think there is both inspiring elements to a lot of that history, but also a history of, you know, them falling short, and particularly around a lot of these questions of kind of international solidarity and anti-imperialism.
Yeah, thanks for that. That was a really great summary. I will say one thing, several things about the New Deal. I think his assessment is kind of fascinating. I mean, you talked about how it broke up, you know, land ownership and for New Africans, but also he talks a little bit about how it created what he calls neocolonial sort of structures within for native people or for indigenous people. He looks specifically at the what was called or dubbed the Indian New Deal. And just to kind of give, he spends so little time talking about that, and he's not really interested that much in like federal Indian policy and in the way that it opened up land, you know, the way that it restructured and attacked native life. He just kind of, I think it's like 2 pages or something like that. He kind of like spends on that in the 20th century, which is a common, you know, I think is a common, that's a critique of mine of the book. I'll do a summary and then I'll just kind of do a critique of what he says. And so he quotes at length, he calls him an AIM comrade, and I had to look at the footnote. And of course, it's a pretendian, but it's Jimmy Durham. Jimmy Durham was a member of the American Indian movement, sort of. He lived in Geneva most of his life. He was kind of an expatriate. But he helped form, like in Geneva, he helped or he encountered a lot of African revolutionaries because people were going there for United Nations work. You know, he met Amilcar Cabral, and he also followed the events of the Red Power movement in the 60s, and he sort of offered his services, you know, at the United Nations to help develop what then became the International Indian Treaty Council in 1974. So Jimmy Durham kind of joins AIM like after, you know, the kind of more dramatic sort of protests and encounters and standoffs with the United States government. And then he writes this piece called I think it's called like On American Indian Culture. And he uses sort of what he calls a Marxist-Leninist analysis to understand the oppression of Native people, but then also understanding Native people as a national, or American Indian movement as a national liberation movement. This becomes the fodder for the FBI and the anti-communist reaction to the American Indian movement to say, hey, look, like they were communists all along, right? And most members of the American Indian movement were like, didn't really understand what communism was. Some of them were like, they were like Marxists and socialists, but not like, it wasn't like, it was an anti-colonial movement. It was it was a national liberation movement, but it didn't mean that it was like Marxist Leninist. But so anyways, I think this quote comes from that book, and there's a book called A Certain Lack of Coherence that it's published in. But Jimmy Durham claims to be Cherokee. Like, Cherokee people have rightfully called him out for not being Cherokee, but nonetheless, this quote sort of lays out how this policy in the New Deal, this Indian New Deal, sort of usurped traditional or tribal forms of governance, replacing them with a council system that was based on the U.S. sort of constitution, essentially. And there was a lot of dissent because it was a top-down approach. It was like, hey, this is like not good for us. But at the same time, there was sort of progressive elements of it. It repealed a lot of sort of bans on dancing, on language, etc. But nonetheless, it did sort of create a sort of neo-colonial rule. It's sort of a devolution of authority down to this council structure that was beholden not necessarily to tribal people, even though they were elected, but it was really beholden to the United States. And so many, this is what led to the conflict in Wounded Knee, or at Wounded Knee in 1973 on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. You had what they called the IRA, the Indian Reorganization Act government, which was the tribal council led by the president, Dick Wilson at the time, who was considered a despotic sort of authoritarian figure. And then you had the so-called traditionalists who wanted to not necessarily bring back the old way of doing things, but it was a reaction to that system to say, hey, this is something that was highly contentious. And even in Pine Ridge, they won the IRA government, the council system, by a slim majority. And not all reservations and all tribal communities adopted it. The Navajo Nation, the largest tribe in the United States, never adopted it. But nonetheless, it created a way, the Navajo Nation, you can use that example as well. It formed its first council to essentially make leases, oil leases to oil companies, right? So a lot of these tribal governments were created around resource extraction. I'm not going to say all of them were. And in fact, AIM wasn't just anti-tribal government, because it's ironic that Jimmy Durham is writing this piece, because the International Indian Treaty Council would never have existed had it not been hosted by a tribal government, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, in 1974. So it was like, it's a little bit more nuanced, right? It's to understand like this isn't a perfect form of government, but it was used as sort of a weapon of articulating sovereignty. And I don't disagree with his assessment as a form, as like neo-colonial rule. It totally is in many ways, but it's a little bit more complicated. It wasn't like AIM was just like dismissing this out of hand, or this was the line, the mass line of the American Indian movement. But it also shows, kind of a critique that I have, where it's like, he's not like he's dismissing ethnic studies, but he probably would have done himself a service if he kind of read some ethnic studies, because he also dismisses Vine Deloria Jr. Custer died for your sins in that piece. He's like, this guy's funded by all these major grants and whatnot. And I think it's kind of a little bit like it's a little bit of a I think a mischaracterization of of Vine Deloria's work. I don't agree with everything that he's ever written, but I don't think that this kind of like just kind of creating this, because it's like, why would you pick that? Like, of all the scholars you could have picked, you picked that one, and it kind of just, to me, shows like he isn't really well read on that piece. But nonetheless, I mean, I think his points are taken. And I think what tends to happen now, and this is something that we don't really talk about publicly, he talks about it in the era of like McCarthyism, where it's like essentially the Communist Party is just defending New Deal reforms. And it's kind of true. And today, tribal sovereignty, when we talk about tribal sovereignty and defending tribal sovereignty, that's essentially what we're talking about too, is defending these reforms that happened in 1934, like, because we haven't really gotten solid legislation or solid reforms since then. So everything from the Indian Child Welfare Act really kind of stems from this New Deal era, like policy, NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Repatriation Act, all of those things. Like it stems from this era of 1934. And when I was reading this, I was kind of like thinking about this, like kind of having the galaxy brain of like, wow, our sovereignty movements, yes, there's been some important gains, but really we're just defending like New Deal era stuff, and we haven't really gotten beyond that. In some ways we have, in very important ways. I'm not trying to diminish the work, but in other ways we haven't really gotten out of that paradigm. AIM definitely try to push that paradigm to a different level, but I don't think we, at this moment in time, in terms of like the legislative reform strategies that people have, the advocacy strategies that people have, that's not really going beyond that in a lot of ways. So I think that is kind of a correct analysis, and I'm very much extending his analysis to even understand our position as American Indians within the United States. So I just wanted to add that kind of component to it.
I think one thing that could be said too, as he said this, is so he didn't go to settlers as a concept because of indigenous people in the United States. The actual impetus for him was working with. He knew people who were basically exiled or visiting from what you would call Azania or Zania, like Southern Africa, right? So the liberation movements in Southern Africa, what's now Zimbabwe, South Africa, the liberation movements against Portuguese colonialism as well, Angola, Mozambique, and so on. And he gets the term settlers from them. Right. And so it's just an interesting thing. And it's kind of, I think, also why, 1983 is a kind of earlier period to be talking about settlers in this kind of work and this kind of analysis that he's doing, even though obviously settler colonialism was something that, indigenous people weren't unaware of this process. Right. Um, but he says that was how they understood in South Africa or Zimbabwe, how they understood white people in their contexts were as settlers. And then he also draws this over to Palestine, right? And to understanding Zionism as a settler colonial project. And so I just think that's kind of important for people to understand too, because I do think there are real gaps in his analysis. I mean, I think that where he does talk about indigenous peoples and the genocidal and the different tactics that are used also to kind of force them into reservations, take their sovereign, like he's attuned to the kind of way that the state moves as this kind of settler entity, as this looking for different modes of conquest, rule, neo-colonialism, and so on. He's attuned to those dynamics, but it's not. I would agree with you that I don't think he had studied that stuff that deeply from indigenous folks. I think that he was aware of AIM. I mean, he obviously references them multiple times. I think he knew people that were a part of that movement. Chicago is an area where there are a decent number of indigenous people also living in this period. And so I think there's some influence there, but I do think that you're pointing to something important. And I think the other thing you're pointing to in terms of that kind of the reform question, because I think that Sakai does ultimately kind of see all reforms as sort of a compromise and a kind of there's a way in which he sort of reads all reforms as losses, right? Or all reforms as um, the state ultimately, being able to disarticulate revolutionary possibilities by, granting something that brings people a level of investment into the United States as a project, right? And into the kind of sovereignty of the United States as this idea. And I think that makes sense when you take a national liberation perspective, because if you're ultimately looking for a kind of liberation of nations from the polity of the United States, then yeah, I mean, any kind of compromise or reform is in some ways a way of combating those possibilities. At the same time, as you say, movements are fighting, right? And they make certain gains. And I think the question is always like, do those gains actually propel people further into a kind of revolutionary possibility, or do they actually set people back in the long term because you get stuck like defending this concession or this agreement that you get with the state? And I think for him, I think he has a pretty kind of hard line, right, around some of these issues of always seeing it as kind of counterinsurgent, as reducing ultimately kind of revolutionary possibility, even if there are some gains, because at the same time, they're always in some ways kind of a legitimation of the US state.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's like, it's interesting too. It's like, because I don't know if that was the path, of the American Indian movement, the Chicano movement, even the Panthers. There was moments in time. I mean, obviously, like there's a whole question of the Black Liberation Army. We don't have to get into that here, but it's not. I don't think it's so clean cut. But I think what he's doing is he's kind of maintaining a purity of critique to say that it's like you might get something, but at the end of the day, it's always collaboration, But I also think that those who do get those people who do get those reforms are not stupid, especially coming from the colonial situation. They're not stupid about what that kind of reform means. I mean, you could say that like about the commutation of the sentence for Leonard Peltier. Yeah, like we had to work with a variety of people who politically, in different circumstances might put me in jail, like, or, eventually, come for the kind of things that we believe, but it doesn't mean that like you sacrifice action, for the kind of the security of purity. I don't know if the security is the right word, or but for the primacy of having a pure politics. I don't think that's what he's doing, but I think that he's kind of opening that up to say, like, if you think about this in a counterinsurgency context, the results of this, they're not going to, you're not going to legislate your way into liberation, right? But I do think that it speaks to the moment in time that we're in. And it's not, I think some people think that that some of us who are like, not on the Democrat train, or like the kind of the politics train or the electoral process, somehow like snub our noses at a lot of these things. It's like, no, it's actually not, it's not about that. Like, I do care who you vote for, but it's like, this is not the primacy of struggle. We can't even have honest conversations about what is real and what is not, in terms of what's facing people. And there's no real political alternative. And I think that's what he's getting to. I think he shares a lot of the frustrations of the people who are even criticizing him. He's like, but he's trying to show a way of understanding it from a colonial perspective. And there's just such a resistance, even in the wake of a 21st century genocide. Like, this isn't something, settler colonialism isn't something that happened in the 19th century. It's not something that's like, there was like we moved beyond that. You haven't, there is no beyond, it, there was this joke, this Australian Aborigine poet, they asked her like, well, so what do you think of post-colonialism? And she says, oh, have they left yet? and it's not, but again, like, then people get, oh, like, oh, do Europeans have to go back to Europe? Then it's like, how is it that your response to these things is at such a sort of affective level, where it's like, you can't think about something, you just react and feel like, oh, it's a zero-sum game. Like, to have, decolonization means that I have to go back to Europe or I have to die. And it's like that's you. That's a you problem. It's not a me problem. It's not Jay Sakai's problem. That's not actually what he's saying,
No,
in the book.
he actually addresses that directly too. Like, so in that KPFA interview, somebody asks him like, how do you, because he uses desettlerizing is a term that he uses, right? And so the interview is like, so what do you mean by that, right? And he says a few different things, but basically he says, look, I don't think there's anywhere for all the European Americans to go. Like, I'm not saying that they're all going to go back to Europe, right? But he is saying that, I mean, and he does actually end up saying, like, look, I think if we could chase the capitalists out and we could get rid of imperialism, that there's a lot that we could figure out together. Um, hey, listen, if Ireland will take me, I will go. I'm ready. Shout out to Chidi Matcha. But yeah, I mean, so this is it is a weird thing that does happen, I think and I think it is, again, part of the real aversion to this book is that people think that there is some kind of argument he's making that's somehow akin to like a kind of white genocide, politics, or like a politics of like, all people who have been in America for generations have to leave and try to, it's not really what he's saying. He's actually it's interesting. I don't agree with, I have my issues with Afro-pessimistic, kind of politics and stuff like that, and writing. But one of the things that Frank Wilderson said once about Afro-pessimism, like, really stuck with me, which was, he said, look, I'm trying to do an analysis of kind of the capacity of white people to solidarity, right? And like, I think that's one way to think about Sakai too, is he's like, look, I'm looking at the history and I'm looking at people who are saying it's going to work this way, right? We're going to unite on the shop floor together. We're going to go arm in arm, anti-racist, against this thing. But ultimately, for some reason, it always ends in like, we're not going to oppose, we work for Boeing, or we work for Northrop Grumman, or we work for, and we're not going to oppose sending weapons to Israel, right? And I think that that's the kind of problem that he's just, really trying to assess. And he would, I think somewhere, if I'm misquoting him on this, apologies, but I have a quote in my mind, which is that somebody at some point asked him, like, what do you think about the white proletariat today? And he said, I think it'd be a good idea. So it's like, it's not that he's like opposed to the idea that white people should develop a revolutionary consciousness and, join organizations, or it's that the history of it is just something that has to be reckoned with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like, what's fascinating too is there's also this kind of like meme culture thing. I really do not like online stuff, so why am I responding to it here? Because oftentimes people ask me this question. They're like, well, what should I do? Or, is there if like, why do people say like it's not my job to educate you? And it's like, bro, this is like literally what why he wrote this. He's like trying to educate you. Like, you have to read a book. Like, I know people don't like reading books, but sometimes you got to read a book. And I think it's a in that sense, it's an invitation. It's not really like a dismissal. Like, I mean, like, there's like, oh my God, if I just like didn't do something because it was uncomfortable, like, that's like the level. Like, why do we why do we have to, as colonized people, sustain so much critique and weight in terms of like us upholding the principles? Like, think about what's happening in Palestine, the level of scrutiny on resistance, right? Like, the even from their own people, like the level of scrutiny that is on resistance, but the bar is so low for everybody else. Like, why is that? Like, why does that double standard exist? You're gonna like, you're gonna lose yourself if you try to constantly meet those impossible expectations of what a pure, like, whatever, like, I think it's just a complete idealism we descend into when movements sort of prop themselves up to say, like, we're going to dismiss, Jay Sakai because we want pure solidarity and all these other things. And it's like, but then why are we always running into the problem where we can't recruit like Black and Indigenous people? It's because it's like, you might have to think about like how you're approaching this problem, right? Or also, like, just because they're not joining certain orgs or movements doesn't mean that nothing is happening. Like, if you look at the last like decade of struggle, at the very least, it's like it's been moved and shifted by Black and Indigenous led movements in ways like, even like thinking about how the state is just cracking down on white solidarity, the idea of white solidarity, like the way that like they came after Kyle Rittenhouse, or they didn't come after him, but they came after his victims. They were like white kids. They like went and demonized them, and they gave him a get out of jail free card. Like, yeah, you can go and kill like white kids who are like in solidarity with Black lives. You have the license to do that. Like, that's the message. Like, that's pretty profound. The war on woke. How did they take something? We're getting canceled today. Like, this is me defending woke. But I remember when that terminology came out, I was in Standing Rock when people were talking about what it meant to be woke. It wasn't about DEI. It wasn't about all of these things. You know, I remember like sitting there, I can smell the mud, I can smell the grass, I can smell the pepper spray that was still on my jacket, and like the tear gas that like permeated all the clothing that I was wearing, because you can't, like, it's hard to wash that out. But I remember sitting there and listening to Leonard Crodog, the late Leonard Crodog. He was one of the spiritual leaders for the American Indian movement. He was talking to like mostly white people, and he was sitting there explaining. He said, you know, by being here, by being with Indians, that's what he called it, is like by being with Indians, he's like, look over there. Your society wants you to be on the behind that police line. They want you to be on that side, and you're sitting here. He's like, you are a traitor. Like, he's like, think about that, what that actually means. Like, what does it mean to be a traitor? And I was like, whoa, you know, and like, that's what like woke was. It was being not a traitor to the, you know, whatever country or whatever. It was being a traitor to this broke idea of like white supremacy. And they will go after like white folks. Even thinking about one of the water protectors, Jessica Resnicek, she got terrorism enhancement charges slapped on her. Like, none of the rioters at the Capitol on January 6th got any terrorism enhancement charges or a sentencing put on them. And that it's because Jessica Resnicek was a water protector, you know, fighting for you know, indigenous sovereignty. And it's again, we're just like, I'm not trying to valorize like white solidarity. I'm just showing the way that the state has used, you know, and even corporations, they're going after Greenpeace, which is a non-indigenous entity, for a specific reason. They're like trying to bankrupt that organization. This is me not defending Greenpeace, but like, that's not what this point is. The point is that they're like, I will defend the solidarity, right? That like the idea that like they're going to go after anybody who sticks their neck out, you know, for indigenous sovereignty, for Black lives. Like, there's a reason why, you know, and to dismiss this book as the problem, like, it seems really I hate to use this word, but it seems very immature and premature, right? It's not to say that like people are going to pick this up and then it's, you know, they're going to have all the answers to everything, but it helps them understand like why we are where we are today and how we got here, at the very least, with all of the kind of problems that do exist. And I do think that one of the things that he does kind of emphasize is that he's doing, you know, a Marxist analysis. This is like, he's interested primarily in class and labor, and you can't dismiss that. And like, going back to the economism that you talked about earlier, like, this book like speaks volumes today in the labor movement, when you have leaders both from the very conservative Sean O'Brien or to the progressive Sean Fain literally sucking the toes of the Trump administration when it comes to tariffs or when it comes to just like reactionary politics, right? That's the state of the labor union, or of the labor movement in the United States. Not that like they encapsulate everything about unions and that we shouldn't defend union rights or workers' rights. That's not the point. The point is that these two figureheads kind of represent both, you know, both sort of sides of the same coin of settlerism as it exists, you know, today, and how we got down this path. So if you don't want to like make the mistakes over and over, that you know, to see like why these kind of movements, and I'm not talking about like Black or Native liberation movements. I'm talking about like this idea of like socialist and left movements then we need to stop repeating the failed projects of the past, and stop investing the kind of energy and time in defending projects that, or not, I wouldn't say projects, but maybe trajectories that that lead us down the sort of path of ruination, where now we don't have a political alternative. We don't have, a good sort of like workers' party, or for lack of a better term, we don't have a good sort of alternative. It's not to say that there aren't, parties out there that whose politics I agree with, or organizations whose politics I agree with, but we need to, how do we scale it up, and I think he's just kind of pointing out sort of the traps to avoid when kind of doing that sort of work. But that's my kind of broad assessment. We're all going to join, we're probably canceled by now, so
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, and I think it's important also to say it was written in 1983, right? And it was written on the heels of, I think, trying to come to terms with the failures of the New Left and to produce a revolution, in the late 60s, early 70s. Like, I think that's many ways. But I also think, even though national liberation is certainly central, like the nation is really important to him, and this it obviously comes from a kind of Maoist understanding of things, but he's totally, like, he is a communist, avowedly so, and is interested in communist revolution, and in socialism and so on, right? And so I think that's also an important point to make. But I guess what I would say is, like, this is a critique, right? And it's a history, right? It isn't necessarily the book. What I would say about it is, it isn't necessarily the book that you would then maybe read to figure out, okay, like, how do I then build? But I
it's not
think
even a manifesto. I
no,
wouldn't.
but I think that it's important for both, right? Like, as we're talking about the ways that we're going to build or how we're going to struggle, like, it is important to be able to assess, like, how those strategies and tactics have, like, fallen apart in the past or been disarticulated in the past. Yeah, one of the this is just a kind of a side note, but I wanted to say it quickly. I found the chapter on McCarthyism, like,
Mm,
really fascinating, because basically he makes an argument that I really hadn't heard before. I'm sure other people have made it, but he's like, look, McCarthyism wasn't that big of a deal. He's like, if you look at what happened to, I mean, he even makes the point. He said more people died, uh, in the American Indian movement or in the Panthers than all the repression that was faced by the CPUSA,
mm,
and he goes on, and of course he says, then you take that to scale, right, of like an actual liberation movement in the third world and the level of violence, like Palestine right now, Yemen, that they get subjected to, Kashmir, um, and he's like, this was actually relatively mild. Like, people got called, and it was mostly people who worked within political office. They had to go on hearings. Like, people had to sign loyalty oaths and things like this. And like, a few people went to prison. The Rosenbergs are killed. But he's like, this is, like, comparatively, if you look at the history of even the counterinsurgency, FBI and so on within the United States, how it has targeted, like, national liberationist movements, black communists, black socialists, just national, nationalist, revolutionary nationalisms within the United States. They all got hit harder than the CPUSA. And I
mm.
thought that was really an interesting point, because again, it might be uncomfortable for people to hear that critique if they uphold that, but uphold the kind of CPUSA style politics. But I don't think he's wrong about that.
Yeah, that's a good. I did like bracket that off because I thought that was really fascinating, and like the like to kind of put that into perspective. People were called, I mean, I think the more famous case is like Paul Robeson, right? Who was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, whatever it's called, HUAC. And like, and Du Bois lost his citizenship, right? Like it, in some ways it kind of targeted, it was very racialized in its kind of targeting. But the effects of it, like the kind of legacy of that, is then you get this sort of COINTELPRO kind of FBI program, that's going after. But then in the meantime, like the FBI was always kind of an anti-communist organization, always going after labor unions, always going after Eastern immigrants or Eastern European immigrants, always going after socialist anarchists, always like doing those things. But then it sort of has a mandate in the Cold War to kind of take it to the next level for a variety of reasons. But to kind of put that into perspective, like even COINTELPRO, like this might be controversial for some people, but the American Indian movement was not a COINTELPRO target. Because and let me clarify what I mean. COINTELPRO formally ended in 1971. It did all these awful things. I'm not trying to like minimize COINTELPRO at all. But I think books like War Churchill's Agent of Repression actually does a disservice, because what happened post COINTELPRO in some ways was worse, because then you get the paramilitary function of the FBI that's actually fielding its agents on the battlefield. Like literally they're calling it the battlefield. They're wearing flak jackets, they're dressed in fatigues. Before, they were getting local police departments to do their dirty work, right? They were getting their informants to do their dirty work. They were still doing those sorts of things, but now they're militarized. And who did they fight? The American Indian movement. At Wounded Knee, 1973, they had the backing of the U.S. military, the Directorate of Military Services, DOMS. When they went after AIM at Wounded Knee, 1973, and they stayed there for many years on the reservation. That's what led to the shootout in 1975 that led to the arrest of Peltier, and also the many deaths that happened on the reservations, the killings, the assassinations, right? It was a very violent period. Again, I agree with him in his assessment in terms of the scale of violence and terror that was inflicted, not just on AIM itself, but on a reservation whose population was probably at that time like 30,000 people, right? It's not like inner city Chicago. It's a very kind of targeted sort of campaign, right, of terror that they waged on a single reservation and a single group of people. It was similar to what they were doing and what the CIA and other organizations were doing in places like El Salvador at the time, but the level of violence, I think I agree with him. It's like the repression. I would say that in some ways what happened with COINTELPRO and then the sort of the paramilitarization of the FBI in that moment was an extension of McCarthyism. It was kind of a logical conclusion. It was like, well, we go after the CPUSA, but it's like, then what? Then what do we do? Like, who's the next target?
Yeah. And I think, another, Orasami Burton's Tip of the Spear, I think, is always like,
Oh yeah,
I love this book, and
we got to have him on the
way that
show. It's a great book.
Please do. Yeah, that'd be great. But yeah, the post Attica violence that those folks that were inside dealt with. Again, like, nobody likes talking about this stuff, but like the levels of sexual violence, the killings, like all of this stuff, like it is just, and I think that's what Sakai is saying is like, look, the intensity of these things is different, right? And it's partly him also saying like, look, white leftists, like you might not be repressed as hard, and that also means like you should be firmer, you should be more like committed to your cause, your politics that you say you have. Like you might get interrogated in certain ways, right? But you're actually the people within the system that they are most likely to kind of lock away and throw away the key and go after with gun assassinations and all these kind of things, right? And so I think it's partly also him challenging kind of what he sees. I know that like, Du Bois, Robeson, Claudia Jones, like these are all people that are kind of targeted through the McCarthy era. And so I don't want to totally sound like I'm dismissing it either. But I think what he's saying is like, when you look at the repression, like, what do if there's actually a revolutionary possibility, then the repression is something that we have to expect, right? And, he's kind of saying like we can't use McCarthyism as this excuse as to why the left was destroyed. Like if it was destroyed by McCarthyism, then it was a weak foundation to begin with.
Exactly. Yeah, I think we've covered a lot. I mean, there's still so much to say about this book. I think there's more that I could say. But I think we've done a sort of broad overview of the strengths, some of the weaknesses, the critiques that we have. Again, this isn't a manifesto. You're not going to read this and like get rallied up, to go out. It's not a handbook on like how to organize. It's not a handbook, on how to like disrupt. Some people think it's like this kind of like fed book to like create disruption. It's not actually about that. I think his project is much different. But I also think in some ways this book is like just overhated for the wrong reasons. I think it's underrated for some reasons, and I think some people who have read it and used it in these kind of wrong, what they would call ultra leftist ways, I don't think that was the intention. It wasn't to kind of create separatism within social movements. And he's look at his own background, right, and look at like what he's propping up. Like it wouldn't even make any sense for him personally on an individual level if you think about it critically. But I do think that he's offering, an opportunity, an opportunity of how we can approach this, the kind of, I guess, the failure. I would call it a failure, the failure of a revolutionary movement in the United States. He doesn't really go into, the post-60s moment, but it's nonetheless, I think, helpful in understanding how we got here and doing an excavation of, white supremacy within, the labor movement, white supremacy. That kind of presents itself as progressive, but it's always attached to sort of these reactionary ends. I don't know if you have any sort of closing thoughts on this.
Yeah, I'll just say a couple of things on kind of like the ultra left, the overhated, like, so I do think that there's a way that, I think it's a challenging book, right? And I especially think for white people, it confronts them in a way that they are not used to, which we kind of talked about. And I think the question about it, right, that I think gets, that is rightly a question that some people might have is like, does reading this book actually inspire people to like, go get out there and to try to build something? And I think that's one of the things. I think this is why you do get a lot of people who be like, don't read Sakai, read, Marx and Lenin, or read, and to some extent, like what I would say is no, read both, like read all of it, because and read a bunch of other stuff too. But I think that as we've talked about, it's definitely a critical history. I think that, look, to the extent that he's factually incorrect on things, like I would love to see somebody actually spend time trying to like parse that out and to point out. There are a couple areas I've seen like people dig into some of like the labor statistics or like, his analysis of class formation in, early settler America and so on. And like, that's fine. Like that's interesting. But I think that the overarching points that he's making are ones that everybody kind of has to reckon with, especially white folks that are on the left. And I think the other point about that he's making that's important is for Black and brown people, or for other oppressed people, other oppressed nations, like what he argues ultimately is for considerations of tactical and strategic unity, right? So he's like not saying like never work with settler leftists or never do this, or like they're, he's saying like we have our own goals and aspirations and visions of self-determination and kinds of politics that we're pursuing, and we should engage with other groups where it makes sense on a tactical level and where it makes sense on a strategic level. And sometimes it may only make sense tactically, but it doesn't make sense strategically, in which case it should be a kind of shorter term, kind of arrangement, and you should understand the limitations of that. But that's what he's saying, is he's saying, and this actually does come out of BLA stuff a little bit, is like one of his arguments is that the trajectory and the aspirations of the white left are different than they are for other oppressed nations within the United States. And so he's not saying that, you know, at times they can't complement each other or they can't work alongside. And, you know, I do have my own feelings about whether everybody should be organizing within national groupings. Like I don't actually necessarily always think that's best, especially for white folks, because I there's a lot of organizing of white people within national groupings, and it doesn't usually go that well. And so there are some, I think, organizing problems that have to be kind of sorted out and analyzed when you're thinking about a text like this. Of, does this mean that, you know, white people should go over here and organize for their like white nationalist socialist project? Like that sounds a little bit, you know, concerning on some level, right? But that's not, again, like these are, it gets a little bit of a cartoon at some point. Like this is really not what he's arguing.
No.
That's like the kind of stuff that people will say to dismiss him, right? And so I think what is important is him just saying, like, it is really important for organizations also to be clear on like what are their goals, aims, objectives, and to approach questions of like unity with especially white leftists on a kind of tactical and strategic terrain, rather than sort of an unconditional solidarity with white folks when there's a long history of that not going well for oppressed people ultimately.
Yeah, but more importantly, and not more importantly, but to kind of add to that, is to say that what makes up the labor movement in the United States is not the white labor movement, right? Like it's such an absurd notion, this idea, like, you know, that like somehow there aren't like Black, Indigenous, other, you know, racialized people within the labor movement. But yet we're supposed to handle one as like the universal category and not the others. The others are the exception to the rule, which is like just ironic, because it's like, why are you granted universality and we're not? Like that doesn't even make any sense. Like that's such a weird way of organizing. It's like it's an idealism in many ways. And if we're really materialists, we should be debunking idealist kind of conceptions of what counts as working class or whatever it is, or class struggle. And we should be thinking about like looking at like how movements like the water protector movement, sure, it was indigenous led, but it was in a context and regionalized in some ways. But like not all indigenous people were water protectors, you know, like there were white people, there were so many different kinds of people, and it was a universal category. You could pick it up for better or worse, you know. You could pick it up as a label of something that you were doing. But yeah, but I do agree, like I do agree that there has to be like, you know, it's like, I guess this is like my own bias coming through, but you have to have some kind of vehicle, like whether it's a party formation, whatever you want to call it. It has to be at the forefront of like kind of uniting those sectors. And it doesn't mean that you can't work. I don't agree with that, but I do think that there are like national groupings that need to be sort of have their own conversations because of the unique forms of repression that they face. That's important. One last criticism of this book is that there's like no analysis of gender really in it. I think that would have kind of come forward. I think Night Vision, from what I haven't finished the book, but from what I read, they really take it up as kind of like they build on what he's writing about. But so like that's the kind of sequel in some ways to this book.
Yep, and he's a part of the group again that like co-wrote that with Butch Lee, and so yeah, I mean, there's a couple instances where he brings it in, but it's very muted and like subtextual in this book. It's really, yeah, and I think part of it too is. And I think actually this book would have been better if it had more analysis around gender, because I think part of debunking this, he's trying to debunk again the white proletariat mythology, right? And part of that is also definitely bringing in gender, you know, because it is, again, based on this idea of this white industrial worker, basically the white guy in the hard hat, you know, kind of thing, as the idea of like, you know, this is the revolutionary subject. And one last thing I'll say about that is that that wasn't a real impulse for him. Is he said, look, we've coddled this particular subject for a very long time of this mythologized white worker. And we need to actually be very critical about this particular subjectivity. And as he, obviously it's very different space now than 1983 in some ways, but in other ways it's quite similar. I mean, Trumpism and Reaganism have a lot of overlap, like, and we're also in a moment after where we've seen like vibrant social movements, and now they're like very much under attack. And so I think there is a lot of space for it, but I do agree that, and he would say this in later writings more, but you know, the proletariat in the United States is a very diverse, and he does make this argument in the book as well, that it is a very diverse thing. It is not just like the white worker, that most of the people who are doing the labor, that's actually part of his argument, are not the white men.
Yeah. There's a lot to say about this book. I recommend people read it for yourselves if you're really interested in delving in more. Otherwise, just listen to this podcast. Sometimes I before I was like, oh, don't read what other people like write about things. Now I'm saying, yeah, just listen to the podcast. But I think we covered a lot of ground with this, and I think it only, for me, it's like it only opens up more sort of questions that I have about like, where do we go from here. And I think your work definitely with Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. I watch the YouTubes. I wish you would put more on the podcast. Maybe I'm a millennial and I'd like just do podcasting better. but I have watched some of your more recent stuff, and it's really great. So shout out to your work and all the kind of revolutionary sort of uplifting that you do on that show. Just really like, even like the stuff that's like in this moment in time. I think it's also like Millennials Are Killing Capitalism and Laura Sheehy, because she's been on it. So first, like, it's like she's like basically your co-host, your unspoken co-host. But I've listened to many of those episodes as well. So if you guys are all on YouTube right now, go and subscribe to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. You're on, you have your podcast on wherever your podcast apps. But yeah, do you have any other sort of like places that people can go to support your work or find your work, Jared, or if you want to uplift anything in this moment as we kind of round out this live stream?
Well, first, just thank you, Nick. This has been great. I really appreciated you having us on and us having this conversation about this book that we'll both get canceled for. I mean, we're on Patreon, we're on Buy Me a Coffee. Most social media, we're at MAKC capitalism. So MAK capitalism. Yeah. And of course, support the Red Nation. You check us out if you subscribe to the YouTube channel. That's great. Like you said, there are more conversations these days on the YouTube side of things, just because it's easier for me to do a live stream than it is to like do all the kind of back end work to transition the live stream to an audio podcast sometimes. But we do still do audio podcasts. And yeah, I mean, join an organization, try to find people that are doing the best work that you can find in your community, wherever that is, and be a part of that. I'm certainly not somebody who's got an anti-organizational or anti-communist politics. I support all of that. And yeah, I mean, I don't have much else to say other than, again, thanks for the conversation and appreciate you inviting me on to talk about it.